The year 2020 ended with great focus on containing climate crisis. Countries around the world made great pledges. They announced plans to cut down or at least phase down the use of fossil fuels. But who knew that the focus would soon shift over the next few months? The Russian invasion of Ukraine overshadowed the much-needed debate for the survival of our planet. And now the UN Secretary General has said that this war has showcased the world's suicidal dependence on fossil fuels.
Obviously, when we have a dramatic situation with the dimension of this war that has no comparison with any other conflict in the last decades, there is inevitably a diversion of attention in relation to many other issues. And the sense of urgency in the debate on climate has, of course, suffered with the war in Ukraine.
Guterres made the comments while in Stockholm, where a two-day environmental conference is taking place. The UN chief called for quick and decisive action against the energy disruptions caused by the Russia-Ukraine war.
The international meeting entitled Stockholm.
So it's time to learn the lesson. If we do not want again to be in the same situation we are today, we need to make a clear bet. Massive investment in renewable energy and clear understanding that the dependence on fossil fuels is a suicidal one.
Ever since the war broke out in Ukraine, the West has placed massive sanctions on Russia, and they include sanctions on Russian fuel. Countries like the US and Canada completely banning its oil imports, while the European Union has announced a phasing out of Russian fuel. Note that Russia is among the biggest fuel suppliers in the world, and with the fallout of the current geopolitical crisis, the pressure has once again been put on the combustible and polluting hydrocarbons. Countries are burning more amount of coal to provide electricity to their people. Seabed drilling has increased to procure more crude. The United States, that last year at the COP26 summit pledged to be the flag bearer of climate action, rolled back limits on domestic oil and gas drilling to contain the rising energy prices. The Biden administration has approved about 4,000 new drilling projects on federal grounds. There is also a legislative impact of the war on climate action. Experts say that because of the global inflation triggered as a result of the war, a major infrastructure legislation is stuck in the American Congress. Part of this legislation was supposed to help the US meet its emissions goals by investing in electric vehicles, solar and wind electricity, and energy-efficient buildings. On top of it, money which should have been rolling in to combat climate change and to help the vulnerable countries adapt to the crisis is now getting diverted to help Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is no doubt the biggest crisis in Europe since the Second World War, but that does not mean our planet's fight should take a back seat. For more on this, with us on the broadcast is Dr. Eli Retek from Haifa in Israel. He is an assistant professor at the Berlin University and specializes in energy policy and energy geopolitics. Thanks very much for being here with us. How do you react to the UN chief's statement that the urgency on climate action has now taken a back seat as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war?
Good evening, and thank you for having me. I agree that we have been talking less about climate change in the past few months on the political level because of what's going on. But when you look under that surface, when you look at the private market, we're actually seeing a lot of new investment and new ideas coming in because of the Russia-Ukraine war, because oil prices and gas prices are becoming so high, and as a result also coal prices. You're suddenly seeing a lot of conversation about investing in nuclear or in hydrogen or in other technologies that so far didn't make a lot of economic sense and suddenly do make sense for the private market. Now, it's true that in the short term, we're going to see more use of oil and gas and coal to compensate for what's going on with Russia, Ukraine. But the things that we're doing now, the extra investment, in 10 years from now, they will start to be apparent. So I wouldn't say it's all bad news.
Not all bad news, certainly does sound like good news at this point. What kind of impact will the war have on the battle against climate change in the long run, according to you, especially in the view of the changing global energy equations?
So crises like this in the energy world, we've seen that in the past. We've seen it in the Arab oil embargo in the 1970s, and when oil prices became really high between 2004 and 2013. And what we're seeing and what happens during these times is that we see innovation. There's a lot more urgency for innovation. Now, innovation can go both ways. It could be investing more in renewables and in nuclear like happened in the 70s and in 10 years ago. It also means investing more in finding more oil and gas and coal and taking it out of the ground, hydraulic fracturing and looking for oil in the deep sea. So these type of crises create innovation to find better technology. This technology can lead to more fossil fuels, and it can also lead to more renewables. It's not a zero-sum game. It usually leads to both. And in the 70s, the Arab oil embargo, we saw a lot more coal being used, but also a lot more nuclear being used. 20 years ago, when oil prices went up, we saw a lot more oil coming out from hydraulic fracturing, but also all of the wind and solar coming in. And that's what we're going to see now. We're going to see in the short term much more oil and gas and coal coming out of the ground, but also much more innovation that only in 10 years from now is going to start kicking in. And then the energy mix is going to look a little different. So if we're looking always for a linear path where everything always is good and there's always more and more renewables and less fossil fuels, that's not usually how the energy market looks like. It's more like a spiral. And that's what we should expect.
All right, multiple challenges that countries are dealing with at this point as a result of the war. There is also the energy crisis, the food crisis looming large in several parts of the world. What can countries possibly do in order to undertake climate-related action while dealing with these crises?
So usually crises like this tend to put long-term policies in the backseat, like the comments that we're hearing recently. But you can also see it as a preview for what's about to happen. Right now, the food crisis is a manufactured result, is a result of a war, of Russia purposely not letting grain coming out of Ukraine, etc. But in 20 years from now, these kind of food shortages are going to be more frequent, and not because of an action of one country or another, but because of wildfires and natural disasters and climate change. And so what we're seeing now is a crisis, but it's a short-term crisis. And when is that manufactured? And it gives us a preview for the things that are going to happen 20 years from now. And you can even say it gives us an opportunity to start looking at how to deal with these kind of things. And what will happen when there is an actual major shortage of food that can't be negated with a peace negotiation or something like that. So the type of policies that countries are going to take now in order to deal with the food shortages in Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa, etc. These are the things that are really going to pay off in 20 years from now when these food shortages are going to get longer. So we have an opportunity here. If we play our cards right and governments take this seriously, we can create action plans that will really come into play later on when we need to deal with the climate crisis in full power.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Eli Rettig, also for maintaining optimism when it comes to dealing with these multiple challenges. We're leaving it there for the moment.
Thank you.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.